Okay, yeah, so welcome everyone. Thanks for coming back to this new session of the UCL InfoSec research seminar. Our guest today is Ben Steer from Queen Mary University in London and the Alan Turing Institute. And he's also co-founder of the company Choreograph. And today, and in his research, he's working on complex networks, distributed systems, and high performance graph analysis. And today he will talk about one of his latest works titled Temporal Graph Analysis of the Far-Right Social Network Gap. And yeah, welcome, Ben. Please take it away.
Thank you very much. And thanks again for organizing everything. It's always exciting to talk about the work that we've been doing. So yeah, so this is a joint work actually between Queen Mary, where Naomi Arnold, myself, Iman, and Raoul and Richard sit, and where Felix previously sat. And but unfortunately, he moved over to UPM, and that's how we got to know Hugo, who also worked on this paper with us. So if I move along from here, so just to give you a bit of background on myself, so as has been said, I'm a researcher at Queen Mary and doing some work that's been funded by the Alan Turing Institute, and that's building a platform called Trajectories, which is a distributed temporal graph analytics platform that we used for this research. I'm a director at the Linked Data Benchmark Council, so in there we look at benchmarking, standardization, and standardization of graph models, sort of a consortium of people doing graph tech to bring kind of all of our ideas together. And I'm a co-founder at Choreograph with Haroon, who has invited me originally to have the chat here. I should also say almost doctor, as I still need to do my thesis changes. I'm sure someone will remind me at some point. So first of all, what is GAB? So GAB is an online social network, which has a format quite similar to Twitter, and it has the tagline, it's a social network that champions free speech, individual liberty, and the free flow of information online. And so basically to that end, it has very little moderation. So the only posts that really get removed are things like child pornography, direct threats to people have sometimes been removed when they've been forced, but basically they're very against removing any content off of their site. And because of that, it's kind of attracted users with very sort of fringe viewpoints, which are sort of no longer acceptable on platforms like Twitter and Facebook. And actually, there's been large upticks when those sort of platforms started to kick people off. And because of this, it's actually gained quite a lot of media attention. So there's this whole like, was it free speech haven or an alt-right safe space? And this actually sort of railed up as well after it was found that the Pittsburgh shooter was actually on Gab and had been posting about what he was going to do. So first and foremost, a bit of background. What did we already know about Gab? Well, actually, from some of the people that are on this call, there was some initial research looking at profiling the user base and like commonly discussed topics. So, what are these fringe topics that people are discussing? How does this differ somewhat from what you'd normally see on a social network? There's been some follow-on work from that looking at the actual hierarchical structures. So instead of just focusing on the text, looking at building that into a network, seeing the sort of follower structures, so do you have these sort of centralized elite entities which are, controlling the network as a whole that everyone's interacting with? Bringing in the time dimension, there was people looking at how the texts or the content of Gabs that people are posting has changed over time. So this idea of from welcome new Gabblers, the first post that was ever made, through to the Pittsburgh synagogue shooter, how did the language start to actually become more and more visceral, more and more sort of focused on these fringe ideas. So the idea of our paper is to kind of merge a combination of a bit of these. So looking at the graph as a network, but seeing at the the evolution over time, and as well as looking at over time, looking at different periods of time. So sort of windows or temporal depths to have a look at both long-term patterns as well as short-term patterns. So how did we get the data set? What does the data set initially look like? So we scraped the posts between August 2016, the start of Gab, through to May 2018 via their Gab REST API. So this is quite funny, actually. I was talking to the chap that sat next to me at QM, Dami, and we were looking for sort of interesting, weird social networks to do some analysis on. And we found Gab, and there was this picture. We went on the homepage. There's this horrendous picture of Hitler. It just said Hitler done nothing wrong, and the comment section was a total dumpster fire. We said this is probably going to be an interesting network to do some analysis on. So it was like, how do we get the data? Well, I thought, okay, well, I'll try /posts, and it returned /post/1, and it returned the first post in this lovely JSON. So we set a lovely for loop going in Python that pulled all of these posts down into a database and gave us this really interesting graph that we could start having a look at. And the sort of interesting thing about the network from just the network's perspective is that when you look at social media, it tends to be of a very small sample, but here we actually had the entire network in its entirety, and we could start having a look at things in a lot more detail. So we wanted to have a look, build up an interaction network of how people were posting to each other or interacting with each other's content. So over the entire data set, there was about 170,000 users. And of that, almost 50% of those users never replied to anything. So all they did was kind of broadcast out sort of whatever they wanted to talk about, and then never responded to anyone. So of that, about half, obviously, of the posts that we saw were of actual interactions between people. And then about 40% of that were actually as replies. So people actually interacting with each other. And there's actually a substantial amount of self-replies where people are sort of following on information that they previously posted. So looking at this at a high level as the aggregate graph or network of interactions, we actually have quite an interesting distribution of these interactions. So first and foremost, looking at the blue line, so node degree, so basically the average amount of interactions the number of interactions that users have, you find that the vast majority of users have very few interactions, and then there's quite a long tail of for people that have more and more. But even at the highest amount, users only have a couple of thousand total interactions. So the amount of people that they're interacting with as a whole is fairly small in terms of gross number. When we have a look at in the orange line, so this is node interaction degree, like a weighted degree. So in this instance, if I sent you a message, you've sent one back, and I've sent one back following, then this would be a weight of 3 instead of 1. You find a similar pattern, but that actually there are certain pairs of users that have a very large number of interactions between each other. The interesting thing here is that this isn't necessarily reciprocal. It could be that there's just one person that keeps on blasting someone else with responses, which is, given Gab is often the case. And of that, they're looking at the orange line at the bottom. Over 52% of user pairs that only interact once. So there's very few instances where basically there's like a friendly sort of back and forth that happens over periods of time. It's actually just, one person posts, another person responds with something saying they agree or they disagree, and that's the end of the interaction. So it's not a particularly friendly network. It's more of this kind of broadcast sort of pushing media out there sort of platform. So we wanted to then delve in using this temporal and graph sort of methodology and ask a couple of questions. So the first question we were interested in asking is, to what extent is Gab growing in its user base and interactions? And so what is actually driving the growth on the site? The second question we're interested in is cohesion. So can Gab really be considered a single community? So, where everyone's interacting with each other, or is it more that everyone is split off into their own little communities and there's not very much interaction between them? And then thirdly, we are interested in the influence that users have in Gab. So, is it dominated by the same sort of very powerful users that you tend to see in other social networks? And do these users change over time? Are they established early on and never swap, or are people more swinging about? So for that, we built a temporal graph representation. So again, as I can get into if people are interested, this is using the tool Raftery. And the premise of Raftery is that instead of just keeping the most up-to-date version of the graph, for each vertex or user in this case that you have, and for each edge or in this case interaction that you have in the network, you maintain a full history of when changes have occurred. So when the node has been created, when it's been updated, and possibly not necessarily in this instance, when it's been deleted. So once you have this full history available for all of your entities, what you can start doing is looking over windows of time throughout the period of time. So let's say I'm interested in yesterday at 9 in the morning, and I want to look back 24 hours. So that's, you're sort of filtering from a set point back to another set point and only looking at what's happened within the graph within this period. So what we wanted to do is look at the evolution. So go from the very start back in August 2016 through to May 2018, moving forward an hour at a time, but then looking back at different timescales. So this is ranging from things like an hour, a day, a week, a month, a year, and then the full aggregate graph. And then seeing, do you see different patterns that have occurred given these different window sizes? And then so obviously we had the intuition that when you look at the larger window sizes, or in the case of the aggregate graph, then everything seems quite stable and you get kind of the, some sort of overarching story. But when you shrink down the windows, you start to get a bit better idea of what's happening on the day-to-day in the network, and gives you, what's happening in terms of short trends, and if this network growth is just small bursts and so on. So if on that point, we move on to our first question, so the growth of GAB. So first metric that we then had a look at is just purely the number of users over time. So looking at this with different window sizes. So the interesting thing here is if we look at the dotted line, what appears to be happening in GAB is that you have sort of a very slow, steady growth. More users are joining the network following some sort of peak at the end of 2016. But actually, if you look on different window sizes, so down to something, especially like a month or a week, what you actually see is that you have these small bursts of user activity where new users appear to be joining the network, and then that slowly sort of slopes back down to a sort of steady norm around 10,000 active users. So the interesting thing here is that this is actually sort of peaked around specific events that happened a lot of the times in American politics. So for example, this big jump at the beginning was Trump winning the election in 2016. Then you have things like the Unite the Right rally, Twitter suspending lots of white nationalists and so on. And so just to double check this, we obviously check this against the content for posts around that time. And the sort of content corresponded with these sort of events. So actually what's happening is the GAB really wasn't growing so much. You just had kind of spikes of user activity around the time when people felt that they couldn't perhaps discuss it on other social networks. Interestingly as well is that these users are fairly transient. So about a quarter of users in any given month are just totally new. So a lot of people would join the network, use it for a little bit, and then they sort of lose interest in it and it dies off. So you see similar patterns when you then look at the interactions or edges in the network. So the interesting thing here as well is that over half the edges on all time scales between users are users that have actually never interacted with each other before. So sort of going back to what we were talking about, user interactions, it's actually the instance that for the most part, when you see a person responding to another person, it's not that they're sort of friends and they actively discuss, it's that someone's hopping on to have an argument with someone, and then these two people split ways and never speak again. Moving on to then the second question of cohesion. So what's the sort of community structures that exist in the network? So to have a look at this, we done, again, very basic algorithm looking at connected components. So the idea of connected components, for those that haven't seen it before, is that if you have a set of nodes that are reachable from each other, so there's edges between them, and then you would consider them a component. So if you had, say, two vertices over here that are connected and two vertices over here, but there's no edges between any of them, then these would be two separate components. So what you tend to see in social networks is that over time there's a densification. So more and more edges start coming in, more people start interacting with each other, and the overall you get what the largest connected components are becoming basically the entire network. So almost everyone is reachable from each other in some sense, with only very, very few fringe, like singular nodes that have no connections floating off on their own. So the interesting thing here with GAB was that when you look at the larger window sizes, so the aggregate graph down to a day, is that this large connected component basically always exists. So it's more than 90% of the graph, everyone's involved and is somewhat connected to each other. However, when you go below this period of time, you actually see a fluctuation where the largest connected component forms during the day hours and then splits apart into nothing in the night hours. So you actually get this formation and split into much smaller communities talking amongst themselves. And the interesting thing with that is that this has never actually been seen in social networks before. So we're not sure if this appears in other social networks. We don't have the full data set of, say, Twitter or something to analyze this, but it would definitely be exciting to explore that as a possibility. So then taking that in and sort of zooming into this into these hourly windows, we can have a look at the sort of typical week within Gab. So for this, you see this sort of the pattern or diurnal pattern where during the daylight hours, you have this twin peak. So this is accustomed to the US user base, and then followed by the slightly smaller EU user base of mainly UK and German users. And then, as I said, during the nighttime, this actually goes down to, well below at sometimes 10%. So basically, there's lots of small communities that are formed, and then these rejoin back together. And again, looking at these smaller communities, this isn't necessarily actually just like a sort of a break in half or good chunks of the users. You tend to actually see a lot of just pairs. So two people that are interacting with each other or responding to each other. Instead of what you'd expect of perhaps, the sort of German-speaking community being off to the side talking to each other, and then like maybe a nighttime English-speaking community that are chunked together. So then onto our third question, looking at influence. So is Gab dominated by sort of this sort of powerful set of users that everyone speaks to? And I guess the long and the short answer to this is basically yes. So if we look at the larger window sizes, so in terms of like the months and the weeks and the years, you find that a very small number of users sit within the top 20. And these do not change very much. And in fact, they don't move around very much at all. Even going down to the hour, however, you only have around 800 users that enter the top 20, and then most of them very quickly leave that. So the interesting thing to note with the interaction graph is, because people can be interacted with when they're asleep, those users that do sit at the top, may be getting posts in the evening, which is going to keep that churning for them. But yeah, basically, for the most part, people being interacted with consist of a very small chunk of users. And if we were to have a look at this in terms of trajectories, so of the all-time top 20, so taking the aggregate graph and pushing this towards from the very end of the network, and having a look at how their evolution how did they get to that point, we find some very interesting things. So if we look at the yearly pattern, we have a very little change in the order of your top 20. So for instance, here, user 31, who is actually the CEO of Gab, sits way up and above. So I should specify this is done by in degree. So basically, how many incoming interactions does a user have? And that user never drops below first place. Similarly, user 39668, the orange line here on the right, was the CTO of Gab, but only for the first couple of months of the network. And he basically sat at number 2, over a year after he had left the network totally. So when people look at aggregate networks and they look at these rankings for most important users, if they're taking this into a consideration, actually they may be ranking people that are no longer relevant at all in the network. So when we go down to the monthly, you actually see some slightly more change and interesting patterns. I realize it does look a little bit garbled with the amount of lines, but you have interesting users like this sort of beige. No, it's not beige. It's more like a olive colored line down at the bottom, who's a popular artist on the network that sort of joined, and then people started to retweet and talk about their content a lot, and sort of rose up in the rankings. So I think that the premise here is that if you're looking for these interesting users, or like who's forming around the network, and is quite important, it's very important for you to look at different time spans to explore kind of what's actually happening at any given point or time within the network. Oh, so I should also point out here, one thing that is particularly crazy is that, so this blue line again, the CEO of Gab, in the early periods of the network, actually had almost 25% of all interactions in the network were to him. So 25% of your network are shouting at you, is kind of an interesting fact. I don't know how he managed to deal with all of those Gabs. So yeah, so I guess in summary, the findings so far. So Gab sort of has an active user base, which is slowly growing, but is often a set of transient users, with a high proportion of the users and the edges that are coming in being quite new. The connect component size varies greatly on an hourly basis, and has this EU and US user base, and this is a pattern that's never been seen before, as far as we're aware, in social network analysis. You have a very small core of users who dominate a large portion of the time in the rankings. And there's, I think, a lot of insights to be gained by using window-based graph analysis. And if anyone's interested in doing this on their data sets, or the more of the methodology behind that, then I'm very happy to talk about that, because that was my sort of contribution to this project. So I thank you all for listening. There's a link to the paper if anyone's interested in reading it, and then to the tool Raftery if anyone wants to have an explore of that. And please, if you have any questions, feel free.
All right, yeah, thanks a lot, Ben, for this nice presentation. I'm stopping the recording and then we move over to the Q&A session.
Sure.